Hi, folks. For those of you joining us, we are just getting situated here. So we're almost at the top of the hour. Feel free to grab something to drink or something to munch on. It's lunchtime here for us in Central Time. We're happy that you're here with us. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, again, welcome everyone. We're happy that you're here with us this afternoon to talk about something that we are really passionate here about at the Lumen Group, and we're really excited to talk about this topic today because we just feel like it just really needs some more attention. And that's the topic of workplace stress, and more specifically, how to recognize, manage, and hopefully even prevent it. And so when I say we, who's the we? I'm talking about we are the Lumen Group. We're on a mission to reshape the way we work together, to co-create more human-centered workspaces that foster increased engagement, satisfaction, and productivity. We do this through a variety of ways: individual and group coaching, on-site and off-site workshops and retreats, and more cohort-based, kind of longer-term leadership academies. And our approach to this work is what we call human-centered. It's human-centered because we leverage the sciences of biology, neuroscience, and psychology to inform what we do and how we engage with our clients. And so let me introduce you to the team that's here with me today from Lumen. So again, I'm Dr. Megan Broger, founder and president. We also have our two panelists today, senior consultants, Dr. Emily Hedberg and Donnie Hobbs. And also helping us in the background is Danielle Simmons, who is our administrator and operations manager. So again, we are excited to be here with you today to talk about this topic of workplace stress, because for workspaces to be more human-centered, the humans in them must be too. And we know that that's been a bit of a challenge, especially more recently, just in the past few years, of all that individuals and organizations have navigated with the pandemic and other stressors as well. And what's really interesting, if we pull data from the American Society of Stress, we hear from them that 80% of workers feel stress on the job. Nearly half of them say that they need help in learning how to better manage stress. And close to 42% say that their coworkers need help as well. So we know that this is a topic of great need, of concern, even to a certain extent, and that it's multifaceted. We want to better understand stressors and the impact of stress on ourselves as individuals so we can take better care of ourselves. But we also know that if we're in positions of leadership, formal or informal, how we manage or don't manage stress also has an impact on other people. So we have several things that we want to talk to today, but the where we're going to start really is some foundational ideas about what are we seeing in the workplace today around stressors, symptoms and signs of stress, and a little bit about what happens in our body when we experience stress. So I'm going to pull Emily into the conversation here at this point and just ask, what are some of the causes of workplace stress that you've been seeing, we've been seeing with client organizations, and then some of the coaching that you've been doing recently?
Yeah, thanks, Megan, and welcome to everyone here today. I think my mind is still a little bit stuck on some of the statistics that Megan just shared as we think about just how common that experience of workplace stress is. To say that, yeah, 80% of us can indicate feeling that way at some point in our careers. And the other portion that just stands out to me is how many people feel like I need some additional resources or tools to be able to navigate that differently, or potentially seeing that in the maybe colleagues and leaders that we engage in.
Mhm.
And I think what's really interesting is that while workplace stress isn't anything new, as you described, Megan, it's certainly evolved as we think about throughout the course of the pandemic and the after effects of that. We've been navigating how we work and where we work in a very different way that we've never done before. We think about changes in technology, AI, layoffs, even just our economic climate. All of these
Mhm.
factors really contribute to this source of stress on a more global basis. But as I think about some of the work we do with client organizations and even in coaching, there are some common themes to what people are experiencing and feeling. Things like maybe lack of autonomy, flexibility that really can be challenging or gets in the way, long hours. Maybe the work hasn't changed or the requirements, the deadlines, but our resources to be able to do that have drastically been impacted. Things
Mhm.
even like lack of support or recognition for the work that's being done can be really demotivating and cause some of that disengagement. And I think another theme that we hear a lot, or at least in some of the leaders and teams that I support, is although maybe there's that time or encouragement to take PTO, it's really hard to, close our computers down and really step
Yeah.
away from work at the end of the day or when we have that dedicated time off. And I think alongside that, just continuous and ongoing pressure is the fact that we may not always have the opportunity to change that environment that we're in. But sometimes recognizing those sources can be really powerful and know that, you're not the only one experiencing these type of stressors, that this is really a common experience, although something we'll talk about, we're just really passionate about, we don't see that as the new normal, or we don't need to accept that as just the new normal.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. A variety of places where stressors can pop up in the modern workplace. Can you provide us just a little bit of context in terms of how kind of the brain and the body are connected in this? How does stress affect us?
And I think it's also important to note, Megan, that there's a common misperception that stress is a bad thing. I think we hear often about the negative effects of that. However, stress in that stress response is really a healthy biological phenomenon. The way that our
Mhm.
mind and body is designed to work can be a really beautiful thing. It helps our survival. We know that from an evolutionary standpoint, that it's protective. It's a mechanism to really help support us, although it maybe doesn't always feel that way. It's really when it becomes this chronic, unmanaged stress that our brains really just don't know what to do with that. They still respond in the same way physiologically, but from a brain and even a physical standpoint, that can have just a lot of negative implications if it's unmanaged or is prolonged, that it's chronic in a way that we can't do something to change or adjust it.
Mhm. Yeah, and so how might we become more aware of that? What are some signs or symptoms that stress is kind of ongoing?
Yeah, I'm just even thinking about, yeah, physiologically how that feels for each of us. And as I reflect on just some of the teams and leaders that I work with and coach, it's different for every person. What those cues or warning signs might look like for me, it might be different than Donnie or you, Megan. So it's really important that we also start to key into, what does that look like for myself? I will say, although that's a very individual thing, we can think about it in some different categories. Physically, people might experience stress or some of those cues as, hey, I'm getting a headache, or I notice I'm having a lot of digestive issues, or my stomach is really upset, or as I'm driving into work, I notice my, stomach sinking,
Mhm.
or that feeling like a heaviness in my chest. For some, it might be more of an emotional indicator. Maybe I'm noticing I'm more frustrated, tense, short fused. Maybe I'm not very fun to be around, and even internally, feeling some of that anxiety or restlessness. For others, they might be more cued into some of the behavioral ways that this might impact them. Maybe I'm losing a lot of focus at work. Maybe I'm finding myself procrastinating or scrolling, social media or doing other tasks that might be a little bit fun or easier as opposed to the things that I really need to accomplish or get done. And for some folks, and we all are to some degree social beings, that might also be noticing maybe I'm just not as inclined to reach out to colleagues or,
Mm.
catch up with them over lunch. And I'm just solely focused on trying to get the work done that needs to get done. And then we also think about that from a cognitive perspective, the thoughts we might have about what we're experiencing stress wise. So maybe that's being more worrisome. Again, that lack of focus or concentration can be another symptom, or even that forgetfulness. If I'm carrying so much of that emotional load, it can be really hard to think about, shoot, I'm missing stuff on my deadlines, or I'm maybe
Mhm.
missing deliverables. Or I often hear from people waking up in the middle of the night thinking of things that they meant to do or need to do in the day forward.
Yeah. So depending on the individual, we can maybe notice them in a variety of different ways, from how we're thinking, how we're feeling, kind of physiologically, behaviorally. And you mentioned something earlier about how stress in and of itself isn't a bad thing, that it can ready us for situations where we need some more energy or some more agility. But there's a difference between kind of that in the moment, getting ourselves ready, and that kind of prolonged experience of that part of our system being activated. So, what do we look for? What's helpful to understand about the difference between kind of a more acute versus longer
Mm.
term stress responses?
Yeah, it's such an important distinction, Megan, because as we talked about, our body and our minds are beautifully wired to protect us, to help us in those types of situations. It's when we don't have that opportunity to reset, to have an ending to what we're experiencing, where that can then be really problematic. Our bodies and brains are still going to work in the same way, but just not as effective. So when we think about more acute stress, as you described, right, it's short term. There's a clear start and a stop to that. So that might even be something like giving a big presentation at work.
Mm.
Leading up to that, right, my body is starting to provide me some adrenaline, maybe some cortisol that's helping prepare me to be alert and hopefully to be on point with the presentation that I need to give, giving me that energy to execute that successfully. So I might notice some of the same physical sensations. My heart might be beating a little bit faster. Maybe I'm noticing getting some of those butterflies in my stomach, but that's preparing me. It's advantageous. Once that presentation is done, though, we would expect that I'd go back to my baseline. My body's had that opportunity to, shake out all of these extra hormones that have helped me in that situation, but to be able to move forward or move on from that experience. When we think about these chronic stressors, things that are more prolonged, unrelenting, it never gives our body that opportunity to reset or recover from that experience. And that's where we see an experience that becomes more problematic and can lead to things like, apathy, burnout, in a way that, I'm likely not going to show up as my best as a
Mhm.
contributor, as a leader. That might lead to more conflict, difficulties in my communication, or even my effectiveness with my team.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So you've said so many important things about just recognizing that stressors can come in a variety of different forms. What's stressful to someone might be different to someone else. How we experience stress is going to be kind of an individual kind of concept as well, in terms of if it's thoughts, behaviors, physiological sensations, and that there's this difference between our body kind of helping us get ready for something like giving an important presentation versus having that system stay activated for longer periods of time. And it's that where that
Mm.
that system is activated for prolonged periods of time without going back to that baseline, where it has the possibility not just to impact us in a lot of the ways that you described, but especially if we're in a position of leadership, either formal or informal, our level of stress can impact other people's levels of stress. So Donnie, I want to pull you into the conversation here as well. Can you share any examples and leadership examples about how stress might impact people day to day as individuals and in their roles as leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Megan. And just to go back and touch on Emily's point about returning to baseline after something like a presentation, um, our stress, we need a certain level of stress to even get out of bed in the morning. And, as we go through our days, we will encounter some of these acute type stressors. But what happens with chronic stress often is that our baseline is actually raised up, and this is kind of where we sit. We're almost at this, right on the edge of being in that, that really uncomfortable, overly stressed state. And then our ceiling also kind of comes down. And so we just have less resources. There's less space to move in between the baseline and the ceiling, which can cause all sorts of different types of issues, from physical to emotional and behavioral. And so I like that visual, Emily, of the baseline, just coming back to baseline afterwards. And that's kind of how we know. And that's maybe a metric for what we talk about with more of the chronic stress is, we hear this sometimes. People will say, well, I took a vacation and I just didn't feel better afterwards. Or, I get a massage a couple times a month, but it doesn't seem to help. Those are kind of the indicators where we want to start to look at, okay, maybe there's some chronic stress going on here that's just always at play, and see if we can help create some shifts there. But yeah, back to your question, Megan, I have a couple examples that I wanted to share. And the reason I wanted to share these is because there's this underlying idea that, what leaders feel, the people who work for those leaders will also feel. But a lot of times they won't recognize it. So I'll go back 25 years. I was working in restaurants, and there was a manager who I was working for, and we'll call him Tom. And Tom had a very quick temper and easily upset. And he was known to kick doors open and slam things on the counter. And at one point, I witnessed him throw a plate at someone, just making people feel really physically unsafe. But it really wasn't a discussion, right? It wasn't like we weren't thinking, wow, I feel physically unsafe. It was just something that we experienced, and we pushed through it and, just kept going, not really realizing what we were feeling, because that wasn't a focus. I think that happens a lot of times for those of us working on teams or under leadership. We don't really recognize what the impact is that the leadership's experience is having on us. So that was Tom, physically unsafe. Another manager I worked for, call him Raul, was very psychologically challenging. He's very manipulative, and he was micromanaging, and nothing was ever right. And, he was really good at just making you feel incompetent and like you couldn't do your job. And so you'd never be walking on eggshells. And so on one side of the spectrum, we have physically unsafe. On the other side of the spectrum, we have psychologically, emotionally unsafe. And as I reflect back on those two managers, at the time, I didn't have language or awareness even. I just knew I felt uncomfortable. And so that's one of the things I think is really important, is being able to bring awareness to what is causing some of the burnout, what's causing some of that internalized experience and pain, and then helping people come up with different strategies and tools for being able to manage those things differently. And sometimes you have to make a change. With the manager who was making people feel physically unsafe, I just left that job after a little while. And the main reason was because I couldn't deal with the temper, but I just didn't feel safe. And so, but often we can really help people create change so that they can navigate their stress differently. And if we start at the top, if we work with leaders and we work our way down, again, that all shifts downward. And so if we have leaders who are, they experience empathy and care about their people, and good communicators, and set good boundaries, those things are all going to have a really positive impact as they flow through the organization. And so with that, over the years, as a consultant, coach, and therapist, I continue to run into all these stories, not the exact same stories, but similar stories where people are really experiencing this psychological mistrust just the uneasiness that goes. Emily, you mentioned, as you're driving into work, you feel your stomach drop. And, what is that about? Why is that? And it kind of begs the question that I think is really important for us to explore. And the question is, how many people wake up in the morning and they think to themselves, I'm going to do a really bad job today. I'm going to see who I can intimidate or alienate, or see who I can stress out. And the answer is not many. So if that's the case, if people aren't getting up with the intention of making other people miserable or manipulating them or displaying less than adequate leadership skills, then what is the issue? And that's really the question. And what it comes down to, I think, is the level of awareness that we have and how much we impact and how we impact other people and the people around us and who are working for us. And so that's one of the key factors that we like to work with. We start there. And if you ask somebody, hey, well, how do you think that impacts the people around you about a certain behavior? You see managers and leaders, supervisors, they kind of look up and back and they start to reflect on, wow, that's a good question. I've never thought about that. I was just, so focused on driving forward and getting my team to, hit their deadlines and their KPIs. Never really thought about how my style impacts. So if we start there, we can develop some really good insights about, are they showing up as their best self, essentially? And that's another question I really like, is who are you when you're at your best? And without, some of these questions, we get stuck in patterns, cycles, and so that's where I like to come in, and I love to do this kind of work with folks and just help them, because we all have blind spots.
Yeah.
We all have these challenges that we show up with. And so.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is so important, Donnie, just about how difficult it can be for people to kind of pause and check in with themselves. And just being aware of what we're feeling kind of moment to moment, hour to hour, meeting to meeting. And not only how we're experiencing that for ourselves, but then how is our kind of internalizing of that and then expression of that to people that we're working with, people that we're supervising, or leading or serving. What is the impact of that? What kind of ecosystem are we creating based on how we're feeling internally? And some of the challenges that we're talking about here is that if people are experiencing kind of more of that long-term, sometimes it's low level, sometimes it's higher level stress, that's kind of pulling us away from our ability to really connect and understand what's going on for us. And so I think, so much of what we're talking about here this afternoon is part of what led us, the Lumen Group, to really try to kind of formalize an approach to how we like to work. And it's what we call centered leadership. And it's that idea that we need to really start with ourselves. We need to start in the center. So Donnie, I'm going to bring up a visual here to share. And if you could just walk us through a little bit what we mean when we say centered leadership.
Yeah, absolutely, Megan. So centered leadership is really at its core all about a couple things. One is resources. Do we have the resources we need to be effective in our role? But more importantly, is about accessing those resources. And so when we think about working from a centered position, we're really in that sweet spot where we have enough stress going, enough energy, enough momentum to move us in the right direction, but we're not feeling chronically stressed. We're what I'll call regulated. When we fall out of center, we become dysregulated, and what that means to me is that our psychology, our thoughts, our biology, our bodies, we get out of whack. There's some kind of miswired energy happening, and so we want to explore, how do we help leaders and folks within the organization find their range, find that space of being centered. And like Emily mentioned earlier, it's a subjective process. Not everybody is going to respond to the same stuff, the same approach. And so we work with leaders to help them figure out, what does in range look like for you? When are you at your best? What's going on there? And also we look at, what brings you off center, what takes you out of range, because it's really, when all of our resources exist in this space, this centered space. And when we fall out of range, our resources don't. They stay put, and they're still available to us, but it is often much more difficult to access them or to use them effectively when we're outside of range. So if we can bring everybody back into the same space and reintroduce the access to the resources, we're just much more effective. And one of the examples that I give when we talk about working from the center is, years ago I was just learning Tai Chi, and I was studying with a class and an instructor, and the instructor was walking up and down the aisles in between students and giving us direction, telling us about the next move, and as he walked by me, he just said, "Stop." And everybody stopped. Nobody moved. And he chuckled, and he was kind of looking at me with his head tilted, and he put one finger out and he put it against my shoulder, and he gave me a little push, and I fell over. I literally fell out of my stance from, one little push. And he said, come back to center. And so he straightened me up and he repositioned me, and, he moved my body in a way that didn't necessarily feel natural, but got me into this position. And then he pushed me again and nothing happened. And he pushed me with his hand and nothing happened. And then he put both of his hands over my shoulder and he leaned down on me, tried to shake me around a little bit, and I didn't move. And he chuckled again and he turned to walk away, and he said, always start at the center. And so that just kind of stuck with me. It's like, if we're off balance, if we're off balance and we get challenging email, how do we respond? Versus if we're in balance, if we're centered, it's going to be a completely different response. And so finding ways, helping people create and develop those resources and having them, allowing them continued access is, I think, key from where we go as leaders. And then that impacts these three things you see here. Communication. Your communication is just going to be so much more effective. When you're out of range, it's kind of like, if you think about a walkie-talkie, if you're out of range, people still might be able to hear you, but it's not going to be very clear. And you're going to have to work really hard to, project your voice. And we see that a lot. Managers, team doesn't listen to me. Well, let's look at that. Let's find out what might be going on there. There's all sorts of different reasons, but if we start from the center position, we can rule out a lot of these other issues. And then climate and connection too are also impacted.
Yeah, and I think, not to break in here, Donnie, but there's a question that's come through, which I think kind of flows nicely with the conversation we're having here, which is, how can we professionally communicate an elevated level of stress when it comes to managing bandwidth in an environment where tasks are just kind of continuously expanding? So when you think about that, where you've got, probably competing priorities, the to-do list just seems to grow rather than shrink. And we need to be able to rely on connections, on our good, effective communication skills, and on being able to engage in an environment, in a climate where we feel like we can, optimally perform. That creates some challenges. So Donnie or Emily, what what are your thoughts here on how do we communicate that elevated level of stress when we're trying to manage bandwidth in just this seemingly ever expanding world of to-dos?
Yeah, that's a great question. Emily, do you have any thoughts? Happy to field.
My initial thought is just the level of awareness in the question itself, right? To be able to already be tuned in enough to recognize that there is that elevated stress. You know, Donnie talked earlier about, you know, recognizing our window, but that requires us to also have that language to be able to know that for ourselves, but to also articulate it outwards.
Mhm.
I think we experience this a lot. And as I think back to even some of the workplace stressors we've talked about, this is a really common theme in the individuals we coach. The demands aren't changing. In fact, they're always expanding, and my bandwidth isn't. You know, that might be also strategies where we start to talk about how do we effectively communicate, you know, boundaries, what's realistic and expected of us, and to really have that two-way conversation with our leadership to really understand what is the priority and what, if, you know, if I'm saying yes to these things, what am I saying no to?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think that's where my mind went as well, Emily, is how do we we can get so focused on content, on the what it is that what we need to do or what we're being asked to do, and this piece about process, recognizing things like timing, bandwidth, energy, skill set, that those pieces are such an important part of this picture as well. So being able to kind of pause with the doing of the things and to have a conversation, whether it's with just with ourselves or our team, to say, you know, what are all of these things here? Do they carry equal weight? Not only what do we need to prioritize, but you brought up a really invaluable question, which is there anything that we can stop doing right now?
Mhm.
We can get really good at adding things to the to-do list, but we don't often ask the what can we stop? Can we make a stop list? And stopping doesn't necessarily mean forever. It can be, you know, can we put these on pause? Because we, you know, it's that 10 pounds into a 5-pound bag kind of challenge. We can't create more time. So we have to think about what other resources and strategies we can bring to bear.
Mhm.
It also makes me think, as a Lumen team, we're reading the book right now, The 5 Resets. And she has just this beautiful analogy of stress. And I think it, you know, in the workplace as well. Think about a tea kettle, right? If I have water in there and the burner's up really high, eventually all of that steam is going to create some noise. And so one strategy might be to turn down the stovetop, right? I'm going to reduce the heat a bit, and kind of what you were describing, Megan. Can we maybe reallocate resources? Do we need to pause certain things? We also know there's times where we can't change the burner or the level that it's on, but we can find other outlets, right? If I can open the tea kettle, can I release some of that through some maybe self-management or even how I'm approaching it? And I just thought that was just such a beautiful way to describe really the choices and the options we have. And even Donnie, as you shared, I think it's so empowering to think about, even in those situations where we maybe don't feel like we have a lot of power and control, we do. We still have choices there.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. It's interesting that you bring up just that analogy of the steam releasing, and I think that brings to my mind, you know, what and maybe some folks are asking themselves this as well. And in fact, there's a question that's come up that I'll bring forward here in a minute, just around. So we understand the realities of experiencing stress in the workplace. We recognize the demands that are placed upon a lot of people, whether they're individual contributors, team leaders, or hold positions of leadership. And so this, what do we do? What do we do to actually take better care, to become more aware, to become more centered? And so, Donnie, I know that you've got maybe some ideas here, and Emily, you might as well, in terms of how do we build that awareness piece to just recognize what's going on. And let me add this question in. So as you both are thinking about, how do we tap in and become more aware? And then how do we take some action on that? The idea that's come up in the chat is that there's someone who's worked for a supervisor who created an environment that was not psychologically safe, and that they loved the work, but was always stressed and really drained mentally, and looking for recommendations for somebody who really still wants to stay in that role, but has concerns about addressing some of those things for fear of retribution or just kind of compounding their stress if they bring some of those things up. So really an environment where some active strategies might be useful. So, with this kind of all of this in play here, maybe, Emily, could we start with just, is there a quick system that people can use to kind of check in with how am I doing? And then Donnie, maybe there's a strategy you can share about how can I take some action on that?
Yeah, and first I just want to recognize how challenging that is, right? To be in an environment that's really just not supportive and sounds like very healthy, and yet really loving the work. So maybe it's, I love the work, or the company's great. We hear that theme too. And that's challenging to know. So what do I do about it? As you talked about building that awareness, and even Donnie mentioned creating some language around that experience can be really helpful to just understand, well, what is going on? We often, as we coach or work with individuals, offer just a framework that can be a simple, kind of 3 steps to walk through. First is really just noticing those cues, right? Before we can challenge or decide to do something different in a situation, it's important to know, well, what is coming up for me? What am I observing? So even in that example, I'm sure you probably have a good sense of whether that's, physically or emotionally, what you think about before you log on or drive into work. You might have a sense of what that lived experience is, what you notice, both in your body as well as your mind. We also, once people have that good sense of being able to honor, really notice those cues, is to create some time for pause. Sometimes we can be so quick between the cues and our reaction to really just take some time to slow down, creating some space between that situation to really just notice, what is that like for me? And maybe even in that situation, validating, right? This is really challenging. And being mindful in those moments can help us to really choose an intentional response. What do I need for myself, for others, to either shift the energy or really change what's happening in that situation? And I think in that, as we think about a response, sometimes that's just my own, what are some of maybe the buffers or strategies I'm going to have in place to help me support so that I'm able to release some of that stress, to not be engaged in that high worry or fight, freeze state in a way that's no longer helpful, or to think about what might be some of those ways to advocate or start to change the environment that I'm a part of. And I note and see in the question too, that sometimes even that fear of retaliation or what's going to happen, are there safe places or people for me to talk through the situation that can be challenging too? It really compounds the situation that someone's already in.
Yeah, that sense of isolation kind of on top of some of that stress. And so you brought up a really important point in general, and again, for our participant here who's raising this really important question around being able to kind of check in with ourselves and try to understand what is driving this. Is it, is it confusion? Is it fear? Is it stress? Is it, and then to give ourselves a bit of a pause so that we can kind of quiet down that part of our system that can kind of create more of a feeling of chaos and an inability to feel like we know what our resources are and that we can access those resources. So Donnie, is there a strategy that we could maybe walk through here relative to that? How do we How can we kind of help ourselves create that pause,
Mhm.
come back to center a little bit so we can better think about our path forward?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, I also want to validate this participant's experience that it's a really hard position to be in.
Mhm.
And so I'll maybe throw out a couple different ideas. One would be this idea of, Megan, in line with what you were just talking about, labeling. So
Yeah.
you label your experience. And
Mm.
the reason I think that that can be really helpful is because if we don't label the experience, a lot of times we just go back and review either the negative experiences that we've had, or we step into this story about, how we're in this terrible position, or how this leader makes us feel so unsafe. And not to say that those thoughts aren't important, but they may not be helpful. They may just be keeping us stuck and kind of feeling like we're that one down. And so if we can kind of label what we're feeling, it might make a little more sense to us. And then often one of the things that I like to do in one-on-ones is help somebody figure out what values being violated with that label, right? If I don't feel safe and I value safety, that's a problem. And that in and of itself is going to pull me out of range.
Yeah.
The other thing two more things. One is, I'd say when you're in range, you just have more creativity, flexibility, and capacity to figure out strategies on how to deal with or work with a problem, regardless of what it is, whether that's a manager or a project. So I really like that idea of coming back to center. And one of the ways that we start with coming back to center is very simple. It's just through breathing. And I've got an exercise here that we could do to kind of highlight the impact that just pausing for a moment can have on our nervous system, which is really, what's geared up when we're feeling that high level of stress, especially chronic stress. So the exercise is called Stop, Breathe, and Be, and I'll walk you through it, and then maybe we could practice it. So I really like this because the mind is always kind of searching for the next thing. Right? What do I have to do? What's next? What's most important? Oh, I just got an email. And when you tell the mind and the body to stop, the mind kind of pays attention a little bit. We're right in the middle of this busy day. What's going on? And if you're still, the mind has a chance to kind of stop, and you can start to notice, what's going on with the body a little bit. And then we take a breath and just notice the inhale and the exhale, and then we just sit and see what we notice. And it's a shift. We're taking ourselves out of a rhythm that we've been in, which may or may not be driving up stress levels, but we're just taking a moment to pause. And so if people are up for it, let's walk through this for a moment. So go ahead and just stop whatever it is that you're doing. You might be having lunch, or taking notes, or working on emails, but let's just stop for a minute. And then go ahead and take a deep, full breath. Inhaling all the way in, and then just let that go. And now just notice. What's it like to be still? The sensations that you notice. Maybe there's an urgency to get on with your day, or maybe there's a sense of calm. Maybe just a second to relax. And I really like this exercise because it brings us into the moment, brings us into the here and now. And that is a big part of being centered. It's being present. If we're too far off into the future or thinking about the past, we're not centered, we're not grounded. And a lot of times when we come into this space and with this practice, we'll realize, oh, I've got a kink in my neck. I need to stand up, move around. or I'm really thirsty. I haven't had any water for like 3 hours. I've been working on this project, just head down. And so you can check in with your body and see what, what messages your body has for you. And I really like that. It's super simple. You can do it anytime. You can do it in the middle of a meeting. You can do it on your way to work. And the more you do it, you'll find the more it becomes this mini reset. And so I like to practice this off and on throughout the day, whenever I can. It has a compounding effect.
Yeah. The thing that I really like about that strategy is that it could just be 30 seconds. I think that's one of the things that when we're working with clients, when we begin to talk about stress management approaches, what kind of comes to mind are things like taking a vacation more often, or starting up a yoga practice, or things that are sometimes very helpful but seem almost unattainable for people. And so just this idea that if I pause for 15, 30 seconds, even a minute in my day, stop, take a couple of full deep breaths, just kind of come back into the present moment, that in and of itself can be something that either pulls me all the way back in or begins to tug me back closer to center, because we know that that's where we're going to be able to access the most amount of our resources.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think the importance of stopping and taking a breath is really vital to our well-being. The same Tai Chi instructor that I referenced before also told me something that made me think. He said, all day long, our minds are dragging our bodies all over the place. So, if I'm sitting here and I get the ping for the email, and like my mind says, you got to do that right now. And my body jumps into gear and my heart rate goes up, and, a little cortisol or adrenaline gets kicked in. And so by engaging in something like just focusing on a breath or Tai Chi or something where the body really has the chance to lead and the mind can kind of step back a little bit and observe what's going on there rather than always being in control. It's another, like, it's from a neurology and biology standpoint, it is literally a reset for the nervous system, even if it's just a couple of seconds. So I love our ability to kind of regenerate and reset so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
It also makes me think, and Megan, you were touching on this, what typical stress management techniques are taught, right? And in a holistic sense are really important, but it's almost like adding something to the additional to-do list. Like, oh yeah, now I need to do this outside of my work hours. And oh, when am I gonna make time for this? Whereas Donnie, you were saying this, we always have our breath with us. We can, in just a few quick seconds, to really just recenter quickly. It's free, it's accessible, it's just that intention to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've heard about the importance of kind of understanding the impact of stress on us as individuals. Some ideas about how we just, like the practice we just did, how we can maybe begin to take small steps to help shift ourselves kind of back into center and begin to notice those things that pull us out. We've also talked about how important it is not just for our own wellness, but as we hear from, are hearing from people in the chat and some of those questions coming up, that how we do or do not respond to stress can directly impact the people around us as well. And it's really about that climate piece in the centered leadership model. What kind of environment are we creating? Is it one that feels safe, or is it one that feels unsafe? And so, that kind of raises the question, what are some thoughts about the role that leaders or even organizations play in supporting the management of stress more kind of holistically or systemically in an organization? Any ideas about that piece?
Even the way that you frame it, Megan, I think is so great, right? We can think about, as individuals, we can't outcope or outmanage a really unhelpful leader or environment. And again,
Mhm.
echoing what we've heard in the Q&A so far. And at the same time, we still need to and benefit from stress management as individuals. But I think as leaders, whether formal or informal, we really have that responsibility to model what we ultimately want to see, how we're contributing to the environment and holding others accountable when we're maybe seeing those behaviors that are not in alignment with a conducive workplace environment. And I think at an organizational level, to also be mindful of how are we supporting well-being and not just simply, we're going to give you an app that you can access or some meditations to do or give you PTO, but to really think about resource management. What is the type of work that we're doing and taking on? What do we value and reward? Is it productivity at the expense of the teams that are doing the work or the people that are doing the work? Goes back to even that, what you talked about in the beginning, to really create human-centered environments. It really needs to be that ecosystem at all levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And it makes me think in some of the leadership academies where we, engage with emerging leaders or new leaders, and even at a higher organizational level with executive leaders, to really think about some of that strategic planning, capacity planning, resource planning, but to also think about what is the culture that we're modeling. Like Donnie said, to have that be a bit more top down. Are we really investing in and having that feedback from the folks who are doing the work and executing the work, so that there is enough information to make some meaningful change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I like that. There's a saying that I like, and I think it's so true. Like we learn by observing, at the conscious and unconscious level, and the phrase is better caught than taught. So if somebody observes you doing something, they're, if they're under your command, under your management, under your leadership, probably going to repeat that. And so, and I think it's really important to be intentional about talking about, your view and your approach to stress management. If we don't talk about it, then, what are the assumptions that are running through the organization?
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe it's modeled, maybe it's not, or maybe it's, one thing is modeled and one thing is taught, and there's incongruence there. And so it just creates, kind of a rough culture to try to acclimate to.
Yeah.
Makes me think of a really good example, Donnie. I worked for a leader who Sunday morning was her time where, with other commitments and responsibilities she had, her house was quiet. And so that was her time that she would like to plug in and get emails done and would get work done, fire off some emails. And for a while, because we didn't have that conversation, I almost took that as, am I supposed to be responding to these? Or what does that look like if I don't respond to that email that's coming in on a Sunday, when maybe that's not my time to be technically working? And so I had asked about it, and she goes, I totally should have done better communication. Just because I'm working doesn't mean that that's the expectation for you. But it really does take that two-way conversation to know, okay, it's stated that we don't work weekends, but people are kind of working weekends. A senior leader is. Do I need to be doing or required to be doing the same things? And so, like you're describing, sometimes it's explicitly in what we share, but sometimes it's really about what are we noticing and observing, and are we being intentional about really showing or telling what those expectations are?
Mm-hmm. And that's just one example, I'm sure, of many that folks on the webinar today can relate to, in terms of how the workplace has shifted with the pandemic. So when are people working? Where are they working? And schedules in a lot of ways have changed. So just really highlighting the importance of that kind of conversation too. Just recognizing that people might have different schedules and maybe working at different times based on any number of other responsibilities, or just when their energy and their focus is working well for them. But what expectation does that set implicitly? And the value of having those kinds of process conversations, because that too, you know, if you hadn't brought it up, just sitting with that stress of the uncertainty of, is this an expectation or is this not? And so as we're, you know, kind of wrapping up our time together today, you know, a few other things that have come through the Q&A here that I just want to open up maybe more broadly for the two of you, as just to think about, you know, what are some ways that people can apply some of what we've talked about today? We've covered a few different topics just in terms of recognizing stress, managing stress, thinking about how leaders and organizations, you know, what their role is in this process. But what ideas might you have for how folks can kind of take something away and apply what we've talked about here today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that I hear a lot is sometimes organizations will do like a burnout workshop or have support for their folks who are feeling burned out in an effort to kind of mitigate some of the high stress levels. But what we hear about all the time is that the approach is great in the moment, but a month later, you know, it's just not sustainable. And so I think the Center Leadership Program was designed with sustainability in mind. And with that said, one of the things that I really encourage people to do is to breathe, just to come back, because like Emily mentioned, your breath, you know, is always with you. It will never not be with you. And so it's always a resource. And how we breathe impacts how we think and how we feel. So if you can shift how you're breathing, that is going to shift how you think and how you feel. And that's, I think, a really good place to start. So that's always my first recommendation. And for how often we breathe, 20 to 25,000 breaths a day, we forget, right? And a lot of people don't breathe correctly. And, you know, when we start to breathe in that shallow, kind of rapid way, our system thinks we're under some sort of attack or potential attack. And so that can drain a lot of energy. And so just being a little bit more intentional from time to time throughout the day makes this a practice that you can use to recenter over and over to begin with. That's one thought that I had. Emily, any thoughts or strategies?
Yeah, I really like that, Donnie. And I think in our centered leadership approach, certainly we talk more holistically, different strategies, things that we can engage. But just thinking recently, I shared with the leadership team about even just putting some reminders in your phone, maybe setting a cadence a couple of times, maybe 3 times throughout the course of the day. And so when that timer goes off, and you can put a little phrase, but just even stop, breathe, be. And to have that be, you know, using technology to our advantage, just as that reminder. Sometimes if we lack that awareness or we're getting really tunnel visioned into a project that we're working on, it can be hard to step back or recognize, oh, yeah, maybe I do need to take that pause. So reminders, and think about that, as you were saying, Donnie, is just that reset.
Yeah. That's really interesting that you bring that up, Emily, because in a similar way, a team that I was working with actually added that, just a pause to the beginning of the agendas of their meetings. So it's just a chance, because so often people are going from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, and who knows where your brain is, let alone your breath when that happens. And so just pausing, letting people just kind of settle in, take a couple of deep breaths, maybe bring to mind what it is that they're there for, what is the goal, and then moving forward. And even processes like that can really have a pretty significant impact on climate. So one of the things we always like to do is start on time and end on time. So as we wrap things up today, just wanted to again thank you all so much for being here. Again, we are the Lumen Group. This is where you can get in touch with us. We would welcome ongoing conversations, especially about this topic, as it is so front and center to what we're thinking about right now. And again, we just thank you so much for your time today. And in the remaining few seconds we have left here, just invite you to pause, stop, breathe, be, before you move on to your next activity today. Donnie, Emily, thank you so much for your thoughts and your input. Folks, thank you for sending those questions in. Really wonderful conversation here today. Be
Thanks,
well.
everyone.
Take care.
Be well.
Everyone.